What's going on, you guys? It's your Huggable Hipster here, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be diving into a discussion topic on what makes a good horror game. There's so many things that make a horror game good, great, or even extraordinary, but I'm going to talk about things that I really think make a horror game stand out to me, and we can expand upon it down in the comments below. I would love to have a conversation about this with you guys. For those of us who play horror games, for those of us who enjoy a good old scare, a good old boop on the nerves, I think that it is crucial, fundamentally, number one, to have a really great story. There are so many things that go into making a great horror game, but I feel like when it comes to the story, there are so many things that you could do that either make it or break it, that make great concepts, because you can have great concepts and not have a great story. You can have great motifs and sound design and really immersive qualities, but if the story isn't there that surrounds it and kind of makes up like the pie, if you will, of what the game is, then it's going to fall apart. Keep in mind, all of the points that I go over today are just from my experience from playing horror games since I was 10 years old. So, I mean, I feel like I know a thing or two about it, but I know I don't know everything that is needed to know about what goes into making a good horror game, so this is all subjective just for conversational purposes. Having a beginning, middle, and end that have a strong sound structure are so important, and it's something of where you could go in the non-traditional route like the Callisto Protocol did, or you could do something of where it's like in Resident Evil 1 Remake, that it was just a classic of where they had, oh, the beginning of where we need to find our team members, we find a horror, a horrifying circumstance, and then we see that one of our own was actually the bad guy. So that's more of like a classic structure on how to go about things that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But you could do things of where you start with the ending first and tease what the ending would be like, and then you go with the beginning and the middle. As long as you have a cohesive flow, the story is what will make or break the horror game. The second thing that I feel like is fundamental, and I feel like is so even more crucial sometimes than the story itself, is the immersion of the sound design. If you have quality sound design, and even the stuff like from 8-bit games that I've seen when I was a kid, like stuff like that, even if the sound design is good and the sound design like immerses the player into the atmosphere, into the story that you're trying to convey, because sound design and story, for me at least, go hand in hand. If you have those two factors, sound design and quality story, you have an amazing game. The sound design has to have a balance of, upbeat parts, really creepy parts, really just downright weird, kind of just spooky parts. I feel like the save music from Resident Evil, again, another amazing example of what can be done when the music is utilized in the correct way. Because if you have great music that surrounds a good story and great characters, then your game is going to be like Game of the Year quality right there. Like, I'm going to use also the Callisto Protocol as an example. The sound design and the way that they did the different creaks and the sounds and like the different atmospheric like layers that they had to it, it really added to the immersion, I feel. Because when you walk into a room, you're supposed to hear the sound that your shoes make. You're supposed to hear the creaking of the walls, the extra sounds that the creatures might make off in the distance in the background. So there's so many things to have into consideration when you are making a proper horror game that I feel as if, and I'm going to say this, and this is going to sound very daring, but at times I feel like the sound design will take precedence over the story, because it is that important to get the player immersed in how the feeling is supposed to be conveyed. Another thing I feel like is very, very crucial in a horror game is to have characters that you care about. This isn't going to be for all horror games. I realize that. This is just a personal thing of mine. If I don't care about the characters, I'm really not going to care much about the story or a lot about the game. I know that, like, for Callisto Protocol or for The Evil Within, those are two very separate games, but I cared about those characters for two very separate reasons. Like, for the character Ruvik, you see his character later on in the DLCs and everything. I think one of them was called The Consequence. You really see what was done to his character. You see more about Leslie's character, and you get to know the characters more in The Evil Within. But when it comes to, like, I don't know, a very small horror game, The Convenience Store, versus a game like The Evil Within, you get characters there that are only supposed to be carrying the narrative forward. They're not supposed to be there for you to care about them. They're only like, their main job is to carry the story forward and to carry the progression of the game. Because that's when you get into differences with characters. That's why I put in that little caveat of, well, this isn't going to be for all horror games, but for me, it's a nice little thing whenever they're like, oh, we put in these characters that you are going to care a lot about. There is a difference between characters that drive the story, and that's their only job, and they're not there for you to care about them, versus characters that have a permanency in the story. They have a voice, they have a narrative, they have something of where, oh, you are going to personify them and care about them. There is a major difference with that. If I'm going to care about a character, I want to be able to picture myself getting coffee with them. You know, there are so many different ways that you can write a character's dialogue or the way that they interact with the player if you're breaking the fourth wall or if you're doing specialty type horror stuff that really gets the player invested into the characters' lives and how they work, basically like run and work themselves in and around the landscape of the game. Because when you care about a game character, you are invested in the story. You are invested in the game. You can't help that, because whenever you play, let's say, for example, it's not a horror game, but Red Dead Redemption 2, you get invested in Arthur. You get invested in his story. So whenever you get invested into a character, you want to see what happens. You're like, oh God, is he going to die? Is he going to survive? Like, what's going to happen? Even the horse, we get invested with a horse. like we get invested in that character so much. So it depends on the writing. It depends on what type of horror game it is. If it's an indie horror game where the character's only main purpose is to push the story or to be a part of the universe and be a part of the player. So another thing that I really think of what makes a horror game is vagueness. What do I mean by vagueness? When you are being vague and not telling the player everything that they need to know, it's very difficult to do that when you're writing a story, because you just want to be able to be like, oh, this happens and then this happens and all of these different things, they happen. But you can't do that. It's so freaking tempting sometimes. I know, because I like to write a lot of different horror stories myself, and what I want to do is I want to be able to convey different messages to the reader or to the player that you're gonna love this and you're gonna love that. But if you reveal an anti-hero's motives too soon, or if you reveal something a little bit sooner than it should have been, the player is not going to really stay invested in what their goal is and should be. When you have vagueness and it's done in the appropriate manner, then you have a long-lasting adventure with your characters and with the player. Not something of where you draw it out, and you're stringing the player along forever and ever, but just enough that it teases the player to keep playing and to keep pushing them and to be like, okay, well, you made it this far and you found this little juicy tidbit of information. What's next? Are you sure you want to know about this? You want to know about that? There's so many ways to do vagueness in a video game that can make it almost painful if the person does not pick up the controller again. Now, this last thing, again, personal preference of mine, but psychology and philosophy, when you add those together in the right way, match made in heaven. It is absolutely perfect. Think about it this way. Remember PT Silent Hills? Yeah, that game. It was just a demo, but it was talked about years and years and years after. What did that have in it? It had the right amount of philosophy. It had the right amount of psychology. It had the strong character bond already from previous games, because it doesn't matter what Silent Hill game it is. People will go in with a preconceived notion and already built-in nostalgia for the games. So they're going in being like, well, these games have these different characters in it. Well, these games have a nod to a Silent Hill that's past. We already have a nostalgic connection with other games. So it doesn't matter if the characters are going to be new characters in any Silent Hill game. What matters is the connection that the player has with the previous games that are carried over into that, if that makes sense. So when you bring psychology and philosophy, which are heavy in a lot of horror games, you have the kind of this mental manipulation, and it's not that it's necessarily in a bad way, but again, much like Vagueness, it keeps the player going and it keeps the player wondering what's going to happen next. How is this player going to survive this? How are these themes and these motifs, how are they going to come to the forefront? How are they going to make everything make sense? We see the same thing in The Last of Us. Even though it technically is an action adventure type game, there are horror motifs and horror themes in there. So when we see the psychology that is in The Last of Us, and we see the philosophy and the questioning of life and the trying to understand what your greater purpose is throughout all of it, it intertwines with psychology very nicely. And the vagueness of, is Ellie actually infected? Can she die? Like, what's Dina's role in all of this? Is she going to die too? Like, there's so many different questions that the player has to ask themselves. And not all of them are going to be the same questions, mind you. Each player is going to have a different base reaction on how they are receiving different stimuli when playing a video game. That's the kind of different stuff we have to look at in regards to vagueness, in regards to psychology and philosophy within these types of games. There are so many different things, so many subjective little gray areas. It is not just black and white here. But you guys, that was it for my video today on our discussion of what makes a good horror game, in my opinion. But if you guys like my face and what I do, please be sure to subscribe and hit that bell down below. I make videos every day here on YouTube. May you find your worth in the waking world, dear hunter. Stay casually nerdy, and I will see you all in the next video. Umbasa.